Seat Radio. It's December 8th, 2025. You're on my 13-mile commute home. Welcome to the show. Well, we're going to see how this works out because the last show that I did, I hit a terrible dead zone. YouTube took a dump, and I think the entire show was a wash. So we're going to start over, I think, with that and go back to our topic at hand. So I was thinking about it the other day. You know, Gen X has lived through like the most extraordinary times, right? In terms of we've seen technology go from frickin' black and white, LED calculators, basic wristwatches, corded phones, rotary phones. And I mean, look where we're at now, right? So we've seen just tons of crazy shit. But one thing I was thinking about, and I've talked about the whole Generation X has seen like the greatest shift in technology. And I maintain that won't happen again. I think that, Gen Z, Gen A, I don't know when we're going to see like the next huge paradigm shift, but hey now, I don't think there's going to be another generation anytime soon sees the massive delta of stuff that we have seen as Gen Xers. So, and I was thinking about this the other day, and it occurred to me that like one of the ways that we've succeeded this time period is through music, right? I'm an older dude. If you're Gen X, you know what I'm talking about. I was born in 1969, and as such, I completely remember a time when there was no, at least not for my family, portable music. There was no way to have your own music, right? There was vinyl, but I mean, like nobody had vinyl. Nobody had 8 tracks. Nobody had cassettes. I mean, all of these things. And now part of this had to do, of course, with me growing up in, BFE, Idaho, right? And I remember going back to, I remember 4th grade, maybe 5th grade. You could bring an album to school and you could play a song from the album during some period of class. So it doesn't go back that far, but by the way, be very careful with what you bring to a redneck agriculture 4th grade classroom if you're going to bring an album to play. I remember growing up in Idaho, and it did not pay to be different, right? We're going to talk more about this because I've got some ideas on this topic I want to discuss. But yeah, so I remember records being, I remember the radio. The radio was the primary dispensary of music. And so that was, at best, choose a genre, right? And if you lived in BFE, Idaho, no matter where you were on the dial, it was country, news, country. And this was all AM, of course, right? So, yeah. But then, we had records, right? Records became like the big thing. And if you grew up in the 70s, like if your dad, my dad has more fucking vinyl. It's unbelievable. And there are vinyl connoisseurs. I mean, I've got friends here on the channel, on the show, Javier, big vinyl guy. My dad took vinyl to a different level. Like, it was almost a religion. And if you've lived through the time period, you know at least one person where vinyl was a religion. And a lot of those people are still there. I mean, they'll listen to MP3s or they'll listen to streaming music. They still have a record collection, and every Sunday, Saturday afternoon, whatever, they will go to this room, a shrine, if you will, with vinyl, one of those old big fucking tubed Kenwood receivers, right? A real turntable with a magnetic cartridge, and heaven forbid you even look funny in that direction of that thing. I'll tell you what. So, yeah, my dad's not quite that bad anymore, but the boy's got a collection of records. But I remember records really well in Idaho. It was the first time I owned music. And that's something that God, does anybody even think about that anymore? Is that something we take for granted? Right now, of course, there's like this huge, and there has been for a few years, right, with vinyl and and now CDs and cassettes are even making this weird comeback. Hell, Taylor Swift is releasing music on cassette, for Christ's sake. But think about a time when you didn't own any sort of means of your music. It's almost an alien concept to think back at this point in 2025. There are people alive today, even older than me, really, that couldn't own music. Not the radio. You turned on the radio and whatever was there was there. Maybe you could go get a 45. But I remember distinctly being, God, how old would I have been? What the hell's 4th or 5th grade? What is that? 11, 12? Somewhere in there, right? I remember we went to a yard sale. Now remember, I'm in BFE, Idaho at this point in time. And so the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. The nearest county or country store was 7 miles away along a very rough, dirty, nasty road. And if you wanted to go into town, that was like a 30-mile trip. That would be either Coeur d'Alene or Sandpoint, Idaho. These are real names, folks. I'm not making these up. Better than Washington names. Spokane's a Washington name. But anyway, so we would going into town was a thing. I know, I feel like I'm fucking covered wagons. You want to go into town and get some flour? But yeah, we would go into town. My stepdad worked in town. He worked in Coeur d'Alene. So occasionally we would go out with him when he would work weekends, and we would hang out at his, the 5-star restaurant that he worked at, the Intrepid, no longer there. Don't bother looking it up. Building's gone. Everything's gone. It's like it never existed. It's crazy. You can find the Intrepid, like if you do a really deep Google search, you could find the Intrepid. But so we would go in, and while my dad was working, my mom would take the car and me, and we would go to like yard sales. And so like Coeur d'Alene yard sales. I don't remember the yard sales very well, but I do remember my very first piece of music that I owned. I owned a piece of music. It was a collection of records, and I can see them. This is the power of physical media. I can touch it. I can still feel them in my hand. I know I can remember which color of the album, because it was called the Hits of the 60s. Now remember, that sounds really old now, but this was like 1979, right? So it wasn't that long ago that the hits of the 60s were. But I can tell you, I can remember the feeling of the vinyl. I remember the labels of the record. I remember which of the records were slightly warped. It was the green one. On side B, it would always skip one of my favorite songs on that side. Who the fuck remembers that shit 50 years later, man? That power of physical media. That's the power of that tactile connection. So I own the hits of the 60s, and I would love to have that record collection again. I would love to own that on vinyl, but that is such a generic name, and it was generic looking labels. I'll never be able to buy that piece of my childhood again. But I was thinking about it, but records that was it. That was ownership. And they say, let me get on the highway here, run into somebody. They don't like to let you merge in here. You notice that? There we go. Now I can just cruise and we can enjoy. What was I saying? So, yeah. But now remember, vinyl. Ownership. Own my music, right? You get to choose your music. Now, when you are in your early years, right? They say that you, as a child, adopt the musical tastes of your parents. That makes sense, right? Your parents control the radio. Your parents control the music. The parents control the TV. They control everything. So you have really no choice but to be party to your parents' musical taste. Whatever's on the radio, guarantee it's going to be the oldie station. My parents are listening to the oldie station. And stop calling me. But they say that somewhere around 13, 14 is when most young people adopt their own music. And so I remember these early years. Now you got to remember, for those of you who aren't longtime fans of the show, haven't listened to the last 20 years, I've dumped a lot of my childhood. I don't remember much before about the 9th grade, really. I mean, in toto, I don't remember a ton about life in general, school. A lot of people, I can name my kindergarten teacher. Shit. I can't name my 7th grade teacher. Well, maybe my 7th grade teachers. But the point is I dumped a lot of it. And there's probably some great psychological imbalance going on. I didn't have the happiest childhood, even though I really didn't have. Yeah, it's another story. If you've listened long enough to the show, you know. But there was one thing about vinyl, about records, about that ownership of music. You couldn't record to it. Right? And nobody gave that second thought, man. Nobody was recording music. You had vinyl. You had 8-track tapes, which, by the way, you know what? 8-track gets a really bad rap. And for those of you who have no fucking clue what an 8-track tape is, right? There's a spool of magnetic tape. Think about a cassette tape. If you don't have any clue what that is, I know I'm losing you. But an 8-track tape was basically this wheel of magnetic tape in an endless loop inside of a little cartridge. You put the cartridge in, and wherever the tape was at that moment is where you listened. And the tape would play through. I don't remember how long the tape threads were. Was it 20 minutes, 25 minutes, something like that? But it would roll back around, right? So it was an endless tape. A lot of early kids' toys had this shit. Like if you had a Teddy Ruxpin or anything else that used one of these sort of tape systems, it probably used an endless loop tape. But anyway, I digress. And then you could listen to 4 different programs on that same spindle of tape. So you put it, by the way, these things were practically indestructible, right? You had to make an appointment to fuck up an 8-track tape. God damn it. I remember clearly being in a friend of mine's brother's car, and he had that 8-track tape that was bolted like unceremoniously under the dash, not part of the car, not stock, not even professionally installed. Some fucker went down there with a couple of metal brackets and like burrowed it directly into the dash. And that was the 8-track tape player. And I remember he had like a center console that had like a line of 8 tracks. And when he was done with the 8-track, he would take the 8-track and chuck it on the floor or chuck it in the seat behind him, right? And then he'd go to another 8-track, plug that shit in. They weren't indestructible. I mean, they were still tape, and, you know, bad things still happened. But, damn, they threw that shit around. It's like cassette tapes. You could do a lot with that. But anyway, so you had 8-track vinyl. Sorry. Going through puberty. You had 8-track and you had vinyl. There was one other class of music. There was one other class of media you don't hear anybody talk about. But I'm going to talk about it because I was part of it. Devo on 8-track. Sure. Yeah, of course. I remember the Beatles on 8-track. I don't remember which album it was. Was it Revolver? Whichever one had Helter Skelter on it. Can't remember which album that was. I bet somebody listening remembers. But I remember that it was Hey Jude, not Helter Skelter. Hey Jude. I remember the 8-track, and this is what really sucked about 8-tracks. Like, first off, if you had the record, if you had the album of, say, I don't know if it was, I'm just going to call it the Beatles Revolver. If you had the Beatles Revolver, you had side A, side B, and the songs ran from outer to inner, right? So there was a song list, and if you listen to the fucking album, it started off with this song, and it ended with this song. You flipped it over, started off at the end of it, right? So, but 8-tracks, in order to make as much room as possible, they would shuffle the songs around to try to fill each of the 4 tracks with as much music as possible without there being any dead space. Sometimes they had to cut a song off, and you could guarantee it was going to be the fucking song that you wanted to hear. And what they would do is, so track 1 at the end of the track would be Hey Jude, and at the end of Hey Jude, like right towards the end, it would fade out. Na 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 na. And then that nasty, horrible clicking sound of the 8-track, clack clack, and then na na na, Hey Jude. It was just, it made me crazy because, you know, my dad had the album and the album sounded good, and Hey Jude comes up and you know it's going to fucking switch it right in the middle. But anyway, so back to this other form of music that a lot of people didn't have, a lot of people didn't understand, but there were, much like vinyl, there was this group of people that had this giant hard-on for reel-to-reel tape. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, did actual humans have reel-to-reel tapes? That sounds made up, Dad. Is that made up? Because that sounds made up. No. There were audiophile enthusiasts. Now remember, like all radio stations, reel-to-reel tape. Everybody in the professional business had reel-to-reel tape. That was the profession of music. But crazy motherfuckers who had endless money to spend had a reel-to-reel deck in their home. That's a whole different brand of fucking crazy, right? And these guys were worse than the vinyl collectors. I knew one guy my entire time growing up. One guy was the reel-to-reel fucking freak. And this guy, Jesus Christ, man. You walk into this room. He had like a radio station room. And you would walk in there, and these, we're talking, I don't know, what are they, 10 or 12 inch reels? He had this shit all over the place. So you would walk in there, and there were stacks and stacks and shelves and shelves and shelves of reel-to-reel tapes. And I'll tell you what, if you think there's a tactile sensation to because he taught me, he instructed me, because I needed to know. You guys know what I'm talking about. I needed to know how to do this. If you think taking a record out of the sleeve and putting it down, dropping the needle, right? There's a huge tactile feel to that. Ain't nothing like putting a reel-to-reel together. You click the reels on. So you have a take-up reel that's empty, and you got this other reel that's full of tape. You click them in. You've got in the pros, it's crazy. It's like watching some freaky fucking art form. They spin that reel enough to get about, 20 inches of tape off of it. Then they would deftly wrap this tape around these heads and these rollers and shit. And then they would bring it up to the take-up reel. They would do that flick of the finger, and the reel would roll up. And then the tape was and you would think that there would be like loose tape between the reel. No, these guys were so good at what they did. They could have the reel all tight, and then you'd play the music. Now, the cool thing about reel-to-reel was, that's right, you could record to it. So that was black magic. Like, if you grew up with records and 8-track tapes, the reel-to-reel was like fucking magic. You're going, no shit. Wait a minute, what album is this? And it's like, no. This is my music. And he would start playing this mix of the Beatles and the Beach Boys and all this shit. You're like, oh my God, this is the fucking future. Holy shit. This is the future, my own music. And I'm thinking, how am I going to buy a fucking reel-to-reel, dude? That shit's so much money. But here's the fun story. Now, reel-to-reel was like a big, professional music thing, and freaks that had to own one. But at some point in time, and you can look this up, they made portable reel-to-reel recorders. No shit. And I'm probably remembering it wrong, because I was pretty young at the time. There was a box like this big, and it had open reels on it, but it was small. It was portable. Sort of like the Commodore SX64 is portable, right? But there was one at a garage sale. Now, we were poor. We were a poor family. We did not have a lot of money. So the only way I ever got anything really cool was once a year at Christmas time, or if I could find something at a yard sale. And so there was a reel-to-reel pocket, mini, small recorder at a yard sale. And I had to bust out my allowance. I think I had to get advanced 2 weeks worth of allowance. And I think my stepdad, picked up the rest. I mean, it wasn't cheap, but it was a yard sale. So, they gave me a good deal. That motherfucker and I were inseparable, at least for a couple of years. I recorded everything. TV, radio, my dad's records. I made my own mix reels. It was I'm telling you, I can't even imagine growing up in an era where like everything is just handed to you. Just push a button and you get everything you want. I wish that I could impart for a minute the excitement of pushing a button while watching Knight Rider, and then 48 minutes later stopping the tape. Okay, the tapes I don't think were that long. I had to flip it over or something. I don't remember. Put on a new tape, whatever it was. But to be able to capture shit like that, it was unbelievable. It was an era that just simply will never exist again. And that's really sad. I don't know, maybe when an EMP takes out the internet, there's no more fucking streaming, and the electricity goes out because our power grid fucking sucks. And what are we left with? We're going to be left with battery operated turntables. That's what we're going to get to listen to. So maybe some of you out there will get to experience that. But yeah, that, oh my God, that reel to reel just kicked ass. I can't even begin to explain it. Then, of course, you know, we moved on, right? It wasn't until, I'm trying to think, when I was still in Idaho, so I mean, Idaho till like 11, I think eventually there was a cassette player in my repertoire, and it was one of those yellow sports Sony Walkman that I got at yard sale. And the tuning wheel, right? Because there was two on those. If you go look up a picture. There was a volume spinner and a tuning spinner for the radio. And the tuning spinner had broken off, and they super glued it back on, and it didn't work. I mean, the button was totally encrusted to the unit. So it looked great, but it didn't work. But that's okay. It's a cassette. It was a cassette player, baby. My wife tried to call. What was that? Hang on. Let me see what I got going on here. I declined. Oh, that was earlier today, I think. I don't know what's going on. I might have to cut this off early and call my wife back, because she wouldn't call on my way home if it wasn't important. And I don't know why it declined. I didn't even see it ring. But yeah, I mean, so, you know, and then, like I said, you had the cassette, then you had the cassette recorder. And oh my God, man, cassettes, I burned through them. You can actually wear out a cassette, and I wore out many of them. And God, I remember getting my first CD player. It was like 1986, maybe 85, 86, somewhere in there. I'd have to do the math. Shit. Again, like every single one of these was this crazy jump, right? I owned my music. Then I owned my music in a smaller format. Then I could record my own music. Holy shit. Now I had a medium that would never wear out. No matter how much you played it, no matter how many times you played it, it never wore out. And that's like fucking getting an everlasting gobstopper, man. Holy shit. Man, I get a piece of candy I can suck on forever, and it never gets any smaller. That was the CD player. And it's like, holy shit. And then, of course, CDs were like 15 or 16 bucks in 1985 money, which made them like $35. Man. So you had to go sparingly, but, you know, Sam Goody, the display with the extra cardboard boxes. It was crazy, man. And I still own some of my original CDs from 1986. And they still, no rot, there's nothing. They still all play great. So pretty neat. You know, we not only lived in great technology, we also lived in great eras of music. And it was just incredible. All right, you know what? I'm going to leave this off here. I'm going to save the other thing for next time. I'm going to call my wife back and see what she needs. This is Shane R. Monroe, Pastor C Radio. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Peace.